Welcome to Myth Informed. I'm your host, Brian Edward. Along with me will be Sean Frasick in 1 second, but is behind the engineer's post at the moment. Today we have as our guest Peter Coffin, YouTuber, most recently known for very important documentaries, Liberalism Sucks. He's got 250,000 subscribers, podcaster, Low Society, and author, Custom Reality, and You. So that's a book. I didn't get a chance to read that. Their leftist perspective goes down easy with relatable humor and a commitment to everyday logic. Or everyday
logic's fine.
And every day, I guess, just use. I was supposed to say people over elites, but in some ways, I think that is a little bit logic. So I want to get into a couple of things here. One, I screwed up the pronoun. So you got a lot of crap for daring to join us accept an invitation to talk right and left with Milo. I just wanted to read one thread that I just thought was particularly perfect for the invective here. So somebody said, they're a terrible person, but I still think you should respect their pronouns. He's not a person. He's a Nazi. Nazis aren't people, but we still respect Nazi pronouns. A third person says, wow. So this kind of invective, and we want to bring right and left together. Everything's Nazi was thrown around. Can you define fascism for me? Because what is this? I hear it all the time. I saw nothing but threads of fascism, Nazi. Let's define what a fascist is.
Well, to start, I mean, it would probably take longer than I can say, but what I would more or less say is fascism is a sort of specific brand of authoritarianism. Umberto Eco made an essay called Fascism. It contains a list of characteristics that are helpful. I don't know them off the top of my head, I'll admit, but it's also an essay that goes into sort of how fascism it doesn't necessarily disappear ever. You can defeat a regime, you can get rid of a party, but there's sort of an ideology underlyingly in a lot of what we do. There's a lot of sort of vertically hierarchical ideas that, if taken to a logical extreme, create the kind of authoritarianism, the sort of, like I said, it's a semi-specific brand of it, although at the same time, you could also say it's a bit amorphous, and that's kind of the big problem. Like if you look at like Mussolini versus Hitler, for instance, there's big differences in the regimes. If you look at a lot of things that have been characterized as fascist since, they share very little in common with those regimes. So it's really hard to nail down an exact definition, but I generally trend towards, we're talking about authoritarians who are very intolerant of anything that contradicts them.
Okay. Now, I heard a definition being proffered to me once that said fascism is socialist, hardcore right-wing politics with hardcore left economic politics.
I disagree with that because, I mean, you could characterize some of what Nazi Germany did as social democrat because they had a few people they had a sort of a program in mind that was, they put in social programs like assistance programs, healthcare programs, et cetera, but they were directed at very specific groups. Like you had to be German born, you couldn't be Jewish, et cetera. And so here's the problem with characterizing that as sort of left economic. The leftist project overall, at least if someone takes the sort of criticisms that people are trying to do more seriously, it does less separation between social and economic than I think you might see a liberal do or a conservative do. Because a lot of people, and I would say that a lot of very exceedingly normal people would characterize themselves as maybe socially liberal or socially progressive and fiscally conservative. And a leftist is sort of like, well, everything is connected. So at least from my perspective, I think that you have to, in some respect, say like this is a universal program in order for it to be an actual left economic program. But again, that's kind of my own personal qualms with that characterization. There's certainly a lot of people who would characterize an excluding or an exclusive social program that targets a specific race as, a left program.
Sure. Okay, so for people that don't know Peter Coffin, he describes himself as a leftist. Personally, I'm kind of a right-leaning libertarian, moderate right libertarian. Sean is
traditional liberal.
Oh, yeah, political newbie.
Mm-hmm.
He used to
90s.
call himself politically disengaged.
Yes, 90s liberal.
Right. So that's the kind of the perspectives we're coming from, which I think is interesting. And it's fun, I think, getting all kinds of perspectives, whether we agree or not. But would you describe yourself also as a left populist? And then can you tell me what you think the difference between right and left populism is?
Well, I would describe myself, yes, as a left populist. I generally am trying to push forward some sort of left populist program. And the contention I have with a sort of right populism is it often does exactly what we were saying a moment ago. And I'm not saying every single person is out to do that who considers themselves to be a right populist, but often people who use right populism to gain power will often enact that sort of, actually socially conservative, economically liberal sort of ideas. I don't, like I said, it's when I talk to somebody who, like an average everyday person who considers themselves to be like some form of right populist, oftentimes that's not really what they believe, but it generally is, at least, like you had your Trump type of right populism, which was very popular with a certain sect of people who wasn't that afraid of demonizing certain minorities. Not necessarily every single person who voted for Trump is in that group, but that was kind of when he was making a hard appeal, it was sort of that economically, or not even necessarily that. In a lot of cases, I will say there were some issues he definitely did go to the kind of left area with, like war during the original campaign. Mm-hmm. He was very specifically critical of imperialist wars. He wanted to get people, or he said he wanted to get people, our troops out of other countries because it's not really our business, et cetera, et cetera. And that's typically a left position. But a lot of people, like I said, and this is, I understand, starting to go around in circles a little bit, but these ideologies aren't necessarily consistent between figureheads and followers either.
Yeah. So a couple things, like anti-capitalist. Does populism have to be anti-capitalist? Because it doesn't sound to me like these Trumpers are anti-capitalist.
No, populism absolutely doesn't have to. Because if we're talking about a right populism, that's almost the distinction we might even start to make, is perhaps the right populists think that really all we need to do is enact this, this, and this, and capitalism will work properly.
Okay. Whereas
a left populist is most likely, I'm not going to say definitely, because I certainly am aware of plenty of social democrats, and the social democrat isn't vying to get rid of capitalism. But there are a lot of social democrats who are also populists.
Okay.
It gets confusing, doesn't it?
We'll get into that later. But what about immigration? So he ran on Build the Wall, and the idea of limiting immigration so you don't have so much unskilled workers or low-wage workers competing against each other, driving down wages. The idea to limit that should increase wages for the people on the middle and bottom rungs. Like, is that leftist, or is that just a sensible policy? Where are you on immigration?
On immigration, I'm of the mind that I don't necessarily agree with the idea that having people come in is necessarily the problem, but rather that we don't necessarily guarantee them a wage that's comparable. I feel like you do create incentives by making a comparable wage. You would incentivize more people to come up here, but at the same time, you would incentivize wages for skilled work to go up, I think. My opinion is that if you set a minimum wage that also includes immigrants, illegal immigrants, or whatever term people want to use. I'm going off the top of my head.
Like you mean you're talking about like guest workers, right? That
yes, guest workers. Yeah. Like if you can pay somebody $2 an hour, that's a problem. Obviously, it shouldn't. It's a problem for not just that person, not just the person who is getting $2 an hour. They're sort of borderline an indentured servant. They're borderline, having to. Oftentimes they live on the property of the people who are employing them at these wages, but you also make the problem that you described, which is that the wages they stagnate. The incentive for the people who are hiring workers is to hire people that they can pay less, obviously.
Yeah.
I generally err on the side of sort of human rights, which do I think that like we just need to abolish the borders right now? There's a lot of stuff that I think that ideally we would do that you can't do in a capitalist system because of the way things that are set up. There's dependencies, there's incentives. I think that we have to find some compromise on this in some way, as long as we're still in this system. As much as I'd like to abolish borders personally, I don't think that if the border disappeared tomorrow, it would necessarily be a good thing, because, there's not necessarily equality here, and they're also leaving their home countries for reasons. There's not necessarily equality there.
Right.
It's a much tougher issue that I'm going to go ahead and say that I'm not much more well-versed on than what I've stated here already. But I do believe that under the current system, we're unfortunately it's sort of an impasse in which the ideal isn't necessarily what's possible. And what's possible, we can't seem to decide on either.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to chime in on that. I mean, we, in the news, we're hearing a lot of, America's the most racist country. We're the most sexist country. We have the most problems. But year after year, the immigration, we're always number one on the list. People around the world always want to come to the U.S. And it just kind of strikes me odd, if we're that bad, if we're so terrible, why haven't these immigration numbers changed? Why haven't they started dropping? Why aren't people going to live in the U.K. or going to live in other areas of the world that resemble the U.S.? I mean, I don't know if you have opinion on that, Brian, or whatever, but that's just something that's really I haven't been able to get past logically.
Mm-hmm. I would go ahead and say that a lot of it is that regardless of living conditions, because you can find places in the United States that are significantly worse living conditions than your average country, but you can find areas in the United States that are very good too. And I think that what a lot of people come to the United States for is obviously the chance at the very good place. Not necessarily, it's not necessarily the outcome that they receive, but, there is sort of a promise of, hey, there's an American dream here. You can work your way up, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
Even though class mobility for people who are born here and have all of the legal bona fides in order to work here, in order to, build a company here or even small business or whatever, that stuff isn't necessarily like class mobility isn't something that everybody experiences. It's actually a very small number of people that do it. So I think that there's more opportunities here, so to speak, but B, that doesn't necessarily mean that the outcome people think is going to happen when they come here is what happens.
Yeah.
But honestly, we have to look at what are they looking for. So if you've come from like Guatemala or something, you may not be looking for economic opportunity as much as you are to get away from cartels. And
absolutely,
you're just looking for safety. That your normal level, if you could achieve that and then live peacefully, that they'd be probably pretty happy.
A lot of the caravans that people come up from are from war zones. They actually come out of places where there is either a private company is doing some sort of resource mining, which has caused some sort of conflict in the area. There's, like you said, cartels. There's a lot going on in the world outside of the United States that, although I'd argue where we are right now isn't as stable as I think we're convinced it is. There is a sort of image of stability in the United States it's if I lived in a place where every day I saw somebody get murdered, or even every month I saw somebody get murdered, I would maybe consider, even if I don't get what I'm looking for, I'm not in a good place now,
Yeah.
Well, when you talk about class mobility, though, there's one thing that I've witnessed and experienced along the way. I've worked with a lot of people that have been immigrants. One of our founders is actually his family are immigrants. He came here when he was 6, and when you talk about like class mobility, what I've noticed is the first generation comes, they work really hard. They establish foundation, and then the second generation, they empower to go to school, take on all of these things, like all the things that you can do to improve your life. And all of a sudden, second generation, third generation, they're doing better. So like, I understand what you're saying with class mobility, and that can lead to some issues, but a lot of immigrants that work hard and have good work ethic do really well, and their family then.
Oh, certainly. I'm not going to say that anybody can't work hard and succeed. I would say that the odds are somewhat against you. What you said, I actually implies a sort of a very deliberate, I would almost say, plan of action. And if a family does come into the country with a plan of action, in some cases that puts them at a bit of an advantage because technically they're organized in some respect. And a lot of American workers are not organized in any way. And I'm not necessarily even talking unions or anything like that. I'm talking about most American workers, whether immigrant or natural born, are for the most part pretty atomized. They're pretty apart from one another and not really executing a plan. In a lot of cases, they're really kind of acting off of an ideology of, if I work hard, I'll succeed.
Yeah.
And that's not to say if you have a plan, you'll definitely get what you want. But,
of course.
It's certainly like that would be something that a leftist is going to tell you for the most part. Organizing, planning, trying to actually collectively work towards some sort of a goal is always going to result in a better outcome, at least to some extent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if people haven't checked out like a leftist point of view, that the 37-minute video "Liberalism Sucks" I think is a good one because you outline it and you talk about what I consider the man, right? Neoliberalism, right? That's the system, right? I used to watch some Rage Against the Machine or listen to that, right? F you, I won't do what you tell me. But
oh yeah.
So David Harvey, you quote this, defines neoliberalism as economic and political practices that ideally increase human well-being. They can best be achieved by liberating entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, free trade. So I'm guessing so that's neoliberalism. That's the system, and all of your videos.
That's the ideology of neoliberalism. Okay.
Yes.
Necessarily the exact implementation of that isn't. I mean, if you look at that definition, it's contradicted very much by how it's actually turned out, which is a structure that looks like it's markets and freedom and all this, but most of what's done is also aided or abetted in some way by the state. The state is very instrumental in neoliberalism, much as it says the state is not.
Okay. The idea is like the consumers, it's talking about exploiting the workers, right? And that the workers are only given a fraction of what they earn because the rest goes to profit.
Correct.
So when you talk about that, but how much do we know? Like, how do we know for sure they're being exploited in that way?
Well, it depends on what your definition of exploitation is. If it's simply like a moral, like you're doing something that is wrong towards someone else, that's not really something I can exactly answer to you. Morals are very relative. They're individual towards, like, you could say, like, it's fine for me to profit off of something. And that's a moral statement. But if we're going by the actual Marxist definition of exploitation, which is, I'm trying to come up with the simplest way of saying it. It's more or less to get something out of that you wouldn't necessarily I don't actually have a good definition.
Sure,
of
but
it.
why isn't it trade? Like here's what I thought of when I was watching it. I kind of watched. I considered the arguments. I paused, wrote down my thoughts a little bit. So if I hire someone, if I'm a homeowner, and I hire someone to mow my lawn, do I need to like give them a lien on the house? Do I need that the idea of exploiting workers? That you're taking a lot of profit as a company and paying them a small wage. But if I hire someone to mow my lawn, like, we agree on that wage, or do I need to give them part of the house, i.e., like give somebody stock in the company?
Well, okay, so what that is that's kind of an ethical / moral argument, and what that is what people are okay with. And I think that in that kind of a discussion, like what you agree on with somebody else in this system, it's between you and the other person. Now, the issue is that, I mean, if we're going to go down that line of it, the issue is that it's not necessarily true that the worker has a full enlightenment as to exactly how valuable their work is or what exactly they're doing. And that is, for the most part, and not necessarily you with the person mowing your lawn, they might full well know exactly what it's valued at. I can't tell you that. But when we're talking about exploitation as Marxists, we're more talking about simply using something to your benefit in some respect. Like, to boil it down, the Marxist critique kind of comes down to the owning of the means of production and using the means of production in a mode in which the worker works for a fraction of the value of their work. That leftover fraction, which we would call profit, would be, surplus value or exploitation. That's what we mean by exploitation.
Okay. What about, I thought of like an author in a novel. So an author writes some awesome novel. It's not white fragility, but it does get to the top of the bestseller list. Does that person then owe the workers that are making that book, like the physical copies and printing them and producing them, all the workers there, and maybe even those that work at Audible that are, putting it out that
producing,
way? Like, does that author owe them the same thing? Are they allowed to take a surplus?
Well, that's a very complex transaction. That's what you end up having is the author isn't necessarily so who owns the book? Is it the author or is it a publisher? If it's a publisher, then the publisher needs to have some. Let's say we're in communism. The publisher is working from the perspective of how do we distribute the value to each and every worker according to their work going into this. But obviously, that's not the situation we live in. When we're talking about an author making a book, the real, I would say, thing that a leftist would demand is not necessarily can we definitely have no profit from the company, because that's kind of unrealistic in capitalism, but rather can we make sure that this is more fair for the author, more fair for the workers on the assembly line? Like, could we pay the workers on the assembly line more if it's a physical thing? Or can we pay the maintainers of the data center more if it's Audible? It's not necessarily, I can't tell you exactly how that transaction would work in communism, because I have no idea how these sort of much more complex transactions would work. Yeah.
So what are you trying to get people to
say that's very hypothetical.
I would say it would even get more confusing when the book is turned into a movie.
Absolutely.
Well, what about
that's the interesting thing about it, though, is how diffuse everything has become. Like, there's so many parties involved, not just in the creation and production and distribution, but in the consumption even. Yeah. Everybody is getting something different out of it. And the sort of who is the owner can sometimes be diffuse, because sometimes somebody owns something and licenses it. It becomes much more complicated. And in a lot of respects, this is why I definitely follow Karl Marx in a lot of respects when I'm talking about economic critique. But a lot of his ideas are very geared towards a much more simple transaction, like a person selling linen to another person.
Yeah.
Uh,
No, that's fine. And I think that what are you trying to get at? Is you're not saying, hey, replace the system with this system over here, but you're trying to expose flaws in the system that we should at least look at. Is that what you're getting at?
Absolutely. Criticism is okay. So a lot of people think that Karl Marx advocated for the USSR. Like, they specifically think that Karl Marx wrote like an outline of the USSR and then somebody did it. But that's actually not what Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a critic primarily, and the idea that he put forward, you could call it either historical materialism or dialectical materialism, and it's ultimately the exposure of contradictions in the current system and the hope of resolving those contradictions with the end goal of a stateless, classless, moneyless society in which the workers are not exploited. Now, that's a long process, and a lot of people don't think that way. A lot of people think I have a utopia in mind that I would personally very much like. And I'm not of that mind. Like, people will ask me, like, well, what's your idea of a perfect communism? What's your idea of a perfect utopia? And it's like, there's so many things that we seem unable to acknowledge that are flaws in our current society, that for me to say that we could develop beyond them to a perfect society, I don't know how we do that. So I don't know what it can look like.
Right.
You know?
No, that makes sense. Wes Cecil, who's a YouTuber, he's a professor at Peninsular College, I think, described it this way. He said there was a piece of Marxism that I felt like is correct. And he said you've got Company A. Company A starts with $1 million and makes $100,000, right? And has 1.1. Mm-hmm. Company B has $1 million, makes $200,000, and ends up with 1.2. So how much did Company A make? And the answer is Company A lost $100,000. And the reason is because the market forces in capitalism will push that. Like, if you're an investor, who do you want to invest in? Company A or Company B? Well, heck, I'm going to get out of Company A and go into Company B because I can get a 20% return versus the 10% return. So in order to get capital, if these are big companies, this is why you get Boeing laying off 3,000 workers when they make record profit, because they didn't do as good as Lockheed Martin or somebody else.
Well, I mean, you could even go to I think it was last year, Activision Blizzard, which is a very big video game company, laid off 800 employees simply so they could maintain the image of a much larger gain than the previous year, which is, I mean, it's not fair in any way, shape, or form. And of course, that's the type of thing that I would hope that a leftist would want to talk about over a lot of the other things that it seems like a lot of leftists want to talk about.
Yeah, but I would make an argument there, though. Good companies understand the value of a good worker, a good employee, and those companies that are laying off are actually kind of shooting themselves in the foot, because the hiring process, there's so much calculating in the hiring process, finding good talent, making sure they can do what you need them to do. So the smart companies actually will carry people at a loss in order to, when the economy opens back up, wherever the case is, in order to prevent all of those future costs is ROI.
But small business can do that. But a large business, don't you think?
No. I would say a large business could do that. A small business can't. The small businesses.
But it's funny because the small business will do it while the large business won't, and yet the large business has the capital to retain its value. You end up seeing the proof is in the pudding. Activision Blizzard's still around. They mess up all of the time, and they keep getting bigger and bigger. Boeing also, like, Boeing is not a particularly popular company with the people, and yet they continue to make more money every single year. But it's a small business who is more likely to carry the workers at a loss, knowing that it's important to have good people around. Which is counterintuitive, and I'm simply making an observation. I don't necessarily have a point, but
well, no, I think it can seem brutal to the average American when you take, like, say, Lockheed Martin was doing great, and then Boeing is trying to get a massive line of credit to open up something else. But they need to show good numbers, right? If their stock price drops, their value capital is lower, so they have less to margin. They have less to borrow. So getting rid of those extra workers puts them in a better financial shape so they could get the loan.
Potentially.
Now,
yes,
right. But that
exactly.
sounds like good business practice from if you're a CEO or you're on the top. But if you're an average worker and you're making record profits and you're laying people off just to get these numbers, it seems callous. So what if like we sort of went back to like Henry Ford's, he had the 3 rules for the industrialists, and he said make the best product possible at the lowest cost possible, paying the highest wages possible.
Yeah.
If our conscious capitalism moved to that, would you be
we're so
happy?
far beyond that, though. Like the incentives are you can't compete if you do that. Like you're not going. If some third company came into the Boeing / I forget the other company that you mentioned.
Lockheed.
Into that, Lockheed. Let's say a third company came into that dynamic and started doing that. Would they be able to compete with Lockheed and Boeing? I doubt it. I very much doubt it, because Boeing and Lockheed would then be, laying off those workers in order to get those loans. Those loans would put them at a material advantage over the other two. Ultimately, it's a system of incentives. So like your owning class is incentivized to do the crappier thing. I don't know if I'm allowed to curse on here or not.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
To do the shittier thing.
Yeah.
And ultimately they get rewarded for it. And that's that. In my opinion, that's part of the problem.
It's interesting.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can see both sides. I see why it happens, but I also can see the worker critique on this.
Yeah.
I think the best one, though, if I'm going to put on my like more populist hat, is in Crystal Ball from Rising. Mentioned this, and what she said was she was super upset about some of the bailouts, and I can't remember if she was talking about 2008 or this one for the pandemic.
Right.
But she said one of the problems is when you're too big to fail, you get this massive bailout of which we took out debt, which means that's your debt, that's mine, that's Sean's, it's all of our debt, and we've socialized the risk, but we've privatized the gains. Meaning
exactly
that I can see why that irks people. That is certainly something that not only Crystal Ball but Sager and Tucker would also agree with.
Yeah, well, if you look at, let's say, a productivity graph, productivity has gone up while real wages adjusted for inflation they've gone up, but it's significantly smaller gains than the actual productivity of industry. And that productivity, you could look at that graph and say, well, that productivity line, that's the real wealth gained. And who gained that? It wasn't the workers. It was the people who are, again, if we're socializing the risk and privatizing the gain, there's your graph to show it.
Yeah. I wasn't for specifically that GM bailout. I wasn't for it. I would have allowed GM to fail.
And I'm from Michigan.
And it wouldn't have failed. It's not like everything would go away. Ultimately,
no,
the
absolutely
stock
not. It would break it down into smaller entities ultimately, and it would be bought up by a bunch of other folks who would then more or less be forced to take on divisions of that and specialize probably in, let's say, you have an SUV company, and then you have an electric car project company, and then you have this and that. And I'm not saying that would definitely result in better products, but potentially that could result in a far more innovative situation, in my opinion.
Well, see, and I disagree with you both on this, because I actually was a proponent of bailouts, only for the sense of the human capital that's involved. When we talk about GMs and we talk about these big companies, I get it. When government gets involved in business, it's never a good marriage. I get it. I totally understand that. But what I'm thinking about are all the suppliers in Michigan. Let's just take Michigan. All the suppliers that are, their companies are based on that interaction. All the employees that have their 401ks, their insurance, all that stuff. All the people, all the actual humans that are being affected by, GM going out of business. Now, I understand that there's an issue there, but I think we could have had a better situation where the government said, hey, we're going to give you this, you need to pay this back type of situation. I don't know exactly what the circumstances were.
In my opinion, if there is some kind of a bailout, it probably should have been more at the company's liability.
Yes.
And that's in some respects also a big issue that I have with the bailouts is that, let's say, I mean, the government owned GM for a period of time, and the government didn't run GM. I'm not saying the government would have run GM better, but
Probably
they
not.
more or less could have
Yeah.
enforced some sort of things on, like, they could have enforced something on GM, and they didn't really, other than you have to rearrange what you're doing here, and you have to pay back these loans.
Yeah.
Which is not enough. It's just it's not enough.
Yeah.
But the one conundrum that I kind of would see for the leftist in this bailout is that, yes, the bailout, I can see why it's problematic, but the people who really made out, I mean, the stockholders got screwed, the bondholders got screwed, but the unions, they got everything. So the unions came out smelling like a rose on this. Can unions be corrupted? Because I do see a lot of, like, in the leftist circles, co-ops, workers' unions, and then
Here's
see
the
this.
Thing. Any power structure can be corrupted. It's not just because something sets out to be something like, and to bring up the USSR, a lot of people like to point at the USSR as a problem of collectivism. And I would argue that it's not necessarily a problem of collectivism, but it's a problem of power structure. A power structure that's not designed in a manner that is extremely accountable towards sort of the downward aspects of that power structure. It's much more corruptible than one that's not. So with a union, I mean, depending on how powerful the union leadership is, of course it can be corrupt. And in some respects, democracy can, like, it can go in a manner that ends in, undesirable results. It's not as though, I mean, I believe in democracy, of course, but it's not necessarily something that guarantees the best outcome, so to speak.
So I wanted to transition, Brian. I don't know if you're done with your talking points, but I wanted to transition to another third rail topic, the police. I wanted to kind of gauge where you're at.
This is a fun one.
Yeah, this is fun. So this has really scrambled my brain because I have all kinds of opinions on this. But from a leftist standpoint, from your standpoint, what are your thoughts on the police and the police system?
Well, okay, so we're gonna have to talk ideals versus pragmatism here, because ideally, I don't think that the police as they are should exist. I don't. I think that it's a problem. I think that they have too much power. They're militarized, et cetera, et cetera. That should be changed. However, I am not sure it will be. Also, I think when I say, like, abolish the police, but I'm not talking about the slew of other issues that contribute to the police is, it's not just that the police, I mean, I do think that they have too much power, and a lot of the time they are on a power trip, and there are a lot of racist police. There are a lot of these problems. But, to go back to the recent one, why was a guy trying to pass a counterfeit $20 bill? Was it because his material needs are met? Was it because that this guy is in a situation where he's not worried about $20? Like, we aren't talking about that aspect as much as we're talking about the police. And if we just ended police today, if we just defunded them or whatever, it was no longer a thing. Or if we replace it with social workers. Social workers are also a vertical power structure that is not necessarily accountable towards the lower rungs of it. But let's just say that that's a non-entity, and we didn't resolve any of the other issues. We didn't resolve, like, the fact that people are not given, the means to subsist in a lot of, like, and when I say the means to subsist, I mean to create a self-subsistency. A lot of opportunities are not afforded to people. So we're still going to have people who are passing counterfeit $20 bills, and much worse than that. So we end up with a situation where the abolishing of the police begins to look bad. So what's the reaction to that? Well, I guess we need the police, and maybe we were wrong, so we need to overcorrect. Like, that's the problem I have with the idea that it's a single issue. It's not a single issue. It's an issue that's connected to every other issue, which, I mean, there's no such thing as an issue that's not connected to every other issue, at least in my opinion. And that's not an argument against abolishing the police. It's, I mean, when we talk about abolishing the police, it's entirely idealism. It's it's a slogan. I mean, is it something that would be bad? No, it wouldn't be bad. But if we're talking about it realistically, then what do we put into place?
Right.
In its place.
No one seems to be
and you
talking
don't really
about
have an argument that is solid
Right.
there.
Right. Well,
in my opinion.
Yeah, and like from my experience, so you grew up in Michigan, right? Were you anywhere near Detroit?
No, I'm actually on the other side of the state.
Okay.
Southwest Michigan.
So I grew up in Chicago, and like I lived as a child. I lived on the south side in some really, really poor areas, and then when I was in high school, I was on the north side. My first apartment was a couple blocks away from the county jail, so Cook County, like the big jail. And it was my first apartment. I had a roommate, and I was going to work in the morning, going to school at night. And every night, my roommate and I would have, it was like we would have this bet: how many gunshots would we hear? And it was seriously every night. And whoever's high, low, whatever, like that was the bet. And I think a lot of people, in my opinion, that are advocating to abolish the police and defund the police don't live in these neighborhoods. They don't live in these environments where street gangs are running the neighborhood. I mean, street gangs, I think there's a lot of people that are saying this stuff that never even came into contact with the street gang. And these people are violent. They're the worst of the worst. These are the people that, well, if you're wearing the wrong colors, you get shot. If you go down the street and you got a gold chain on, they're going to stop you and check you. That's what they called it. Stop you, check you, take your stuff, kick your ass, whatever. If you're in the wrong neighborhood, if you look at them at the wrong, I had like a gang of 10 on the corner every night, patrolling. They literally had walkie-talkies. They'd patrol the area, look for other gangs.
And materially, these people are probably more privileged than the rest because they're making money from certain kind of like illicit activities. So they're actually doing better. But it's the kind of the style or the violent crime can produce itself without material.
So I was getting. So my point is, are the police perfect? Absolutely not. I've had so many horrible interactions with them in Chicago. Terrible interactions.
I have been arrested twice for not paying traffic tickets.
Well, I was crossing the street once, and a cop almost ran me over, and then he actually brought me in and said that I tried to assault him. I was never formally charged with that, but that was his thing. And then you go and you report the police officer and whatever. But
nothing
happens. There's no body cams, right? So, but the point I'm making is, though, in these neighborhoods, in the really high crime areas, the police are actually welcome because, when they're patrolling and stuff, it actually is a little safer. And, my fear is like, here's the thing. If we demolish the police, defund the police, it's going to give them less resources, it's going to give them less opportunity to actually help those people in those neighborhoods that are victim to this crime every single day of their life. Like, I seriously could not walk around my neighborhood without being in fear of my life. I'm not joking. Like, this is serious stuff, and so like that, but I'm not hearing that part. I'm not hearing the people that are talking about those people that are constantly victimized by this crime that happens. We're talking about get rid of the police. I'm all for like better training for the police, having upping their wages so we can get better talent. I'm a firm believer in paying people more, get you better talent, things of that nature. But getting rid of them, in my opinion, is like insane. Without something, I don't even know what would replace them. That's just my opinion.
Okay. So here's the problem: is to have and there's a couple of things I do want to address in what you said, but the big problem is if you just simply abolish something that has this kind of power that is ultimately locked up in these types of. I mean, we can literally say that between the entities you're describing, street gangs, and between the police, there's kind of an ongoing conflict. And if you just simply got rid of one of those, there would be a bit of a power vacuum that creates. And ultimately, you'd have that type of problem. I think the situation would get worse if you simply removed. And I'm even saying that goes doubly, or sorry, not doubly, but reverse. If you simply got rid of street gangs and you left the police on their same routes, with their same prejudices and they might over-police the citizens of those areas. I think ultimately you kind of create a situation where there is a bit of a standoff between these two things. But my question as a leftist would then be, why are there these street gangs?
Sure.
What reason do people turn to that life as opposed to, whatever, like, do they have opportunities? Probably not. Do they have the ability? I mean, there are some people who obviously have those opportunities and turn them down and go for a life of crime. Yes.
Yeah.
But the majority of people who end up in that stuff, they're doing it because they don't really feel like, and even if they do have a choice but don't feel like they have a choice, do they really have the choice? But they don't feel like they have a choice. They feel like that's the path of least resistance. And in a lot of, I would argue probably most cases, it probably is the path of least resistance. And that creates this situation where the cops in this, they're necessary. And maybe not even necessary, but just what's perceived as necessary. And ultimately, like, I'd also argue that simply abolishing the police without having addressed that area of the issue is a serious problem. Like, if you aren't creating a path for the people who would otherwise end up in a street gang, and you aren't addressing that from the start, then you're ultimately, again, back at the same situation described earlier, a power vacuum.
Yeah. And to be fair, though, there are some really good police programs that work with kids on the street, that do work with rehabilitating gang members. They'll actually they'll hire people that were in gangs that have left the gang in order to become a better role model for high schools and for people in these areas. And it's a tough situation because you have a lot of things happening. I had friends that when I was in elementary school that joined a gang. You know, one of my friends when he was 13, he ended up getting shot and killed right behind Chicago Joe's. He was in a gang, went to high school, was trying to get out of it, but some people that saw him that knew he was a part of, this gang, went for him, killed him. And, the stories like that are happening all the time. And what do you do?
Well, I just feel like the people that are saying defund the police, whatever that means, that, changing or abolishing, would be a lot better off if they were more consistent, and that be as outraged about the 3-year-old that got hit as collateral damage from a stray bullet shot between a gang shootout in Chicago.
Yes.
As you are about George Floyd or anyone else that is a victim of over-policing. These things go together. And if you aren't looking at both of those, they're all Black lives. They all matter. So why aren't we doing that? And I think that this whole thing fails for that reason. That's why
I even argue that the reason why is because it's not really, people aren't taking into account the way that I described it earlier, the way that we should be looking at things like what is causing the situation in which we believe the police are necessary, because we're ultimately kind of centralizing authority further upward. And that creates these situations that are more likely to end in shootouts or more likely to end in some form of violence. And, if we're not addressing a much more wide societal, like, are we making it possible for people to live a good life? Are we making it possible for people to, find something that occupies them in a manner that isn't even necessarily subsistence, but even satisfactory? Are we actually trying to make the American dream a thing?
Yeah.
Is that really a thing that we're doing? And if it's not, or it's not for everyone, because I mean, it's I would say arguable that Black people get significantly less opportunities. And when I say it's arguable, I obviously come at it from, I believe that Black people get less opportunities. But if we aren't addressing it from that perspective, then we aren't really addressing what causes police violence, even though it's not necessarily that it's not just the police's choice. It's systemic. It's set up to end this way. And that's the problem, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, Brett Weinstein says that police over eagerness or brutality is a feature, not a bug. Meaning that the system is set up, and if you do have these more militant police, that you're actually stopping more murders because people are afraid of the cops. And, although you'll have some over, that you could take this, again, the CEO could look and it makes sense, right? But on a personal level, if you're the innocent person that gets screwed, it makes no sense, right? So this
exactly.
So I think there's a macro level that some people are looking at where you might say, okay, it does make sense, but then when you pump it down to the individual, you see a person that has been, their life has been ruined, or they've died.
I would also I'd say that like the actual self-interest of the different parties is very important. Like when you're talking about the CEO, it's a member of the owning class, so to speak, and their self-interest is going to be significantly different. It's preservation of property, the preservation of order, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas the self-interest of an individual is always going to be, paying my bills and eating food,
I will say this is the last topic on the police. One of the other things that doesn't really come out. Yeah, there's some bad cops. We get it. I've known bad cops. Everyone knows, there's bad cops. But the job itself, if you think about the job itself, most of us go to work. We're making a decent salary, whatever, wherever you're at. Say you're making $50,000, $60,000 a year. Let's just say that's what a cop makes on average. We don't have to go to work and worry about someone killing us. They do. And that's another complete thing that I think that's something we miss in this conversation. Just imagine having to go to work every day and potentially dying, having your wife and kids know you might not come home. Now, I'm not talking about the police in, like the rural areas or the suburban areas. I'm talking about like in the middle of the heart of like the South Side
where
Chicago,
the high crime is,
or in Detroit, or what, like these areas. This is like really, really serious stuff. And I that's the one thing that upsets me a little too, because I get it, like we can be upset with bad cops, but there's also some really good cops that put their lives on the line every day, and we can't lose sight of that either, in my opinion.
Well, again, that's a much more individualized perspective. We're talking about like from a systemic. I tend to criticize from a systemic or a macro perspective. I try to, anyways. When we're talking about individuals, that's where there's a leftist saying that you might see as the ACAB, which is all cops are bastards, or all cops are bad, or any variation of that. And it a lot of people, sort of individualize it and take it to mean like this means this person is a bad person in all aspects of their life. But what it should be taken to mean is that systemically the police is an institution that is set up along with other. Here's the thing. You can't just say that it's set up to be evil itself, because evil is obviously a subjective thing. But it's set up in the specific interests of a class of people, and it works in tandem with other institutions to enforce those interests.
Right.
And when you say all cops are bad, it means your rational self-interest is to avoid cops because they can be bastards.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, what do you think about this argument? Coleman Hughes makes the argument that police in America shouldn't be judged by other countries' standards like Britain or New Zealand or Australia, because we live in a gun culture. They don't. Imagine policing a gun culture.
Without guns.
Well, at all.
Right.
Policing a gun culture is incredibly more dangerous. Like, your job as a policeman in anywhere in America is more dangerous than Wellington.
For sure. And here's the thing. I've actually had a discussion about this with one of our on Low Society. We talked about how it would have to, in order for the police to not have guns, it would have to be a mutual disarmament, and that's not possible. That's not a thing that would ever happen.
Right.
The people who need to put down their guns first would be the cops, the authority, the people who have the power over us. And B, they're not that would be how it would have to go. B, they're not going to do that. And C, I don't know that people would do that. I don't know that people would be like, no, we'll give up our guns if cops will. I just don't see that happening.
No, especially not, the high crime areas. Those people are not giving up their guns.
And there's a whole bunch of Republicans that are not doing that.
Yeah,
either.
absolutely. Absolutely. Right.
Right.
Realistically speaking, like ideally, would there be no guns in the world? Of course. Absolutely. Like, guns are violent, and violence is something that I don't think anybody wants to live through. But pragmatically speaking, like, I don't see it happening.
But look at the threat of guns that have the upside of having an armed population, right? We know the downsides. right? Lots of people are being shot, right? So I'll stipulate to that. But the upsides are the government tyranny. Now, there's something to be said about that. If the government wanted to take a draconian action, like
absolutely,
get rid of all immigrants, like all legal immigrants, they're out right now. Imagine if someone put that through. A lot of people are going to die, right? Because people have guns and they're going to, and people know it. So are the ruling class or whomever, the governing class, or even an authoritarian governing class is going to think twice before they do that. And that's the upside of having it that I don't think ever gets mentioned.
Well, here's the thing. I am not against guns. Like you hear me say, like, ideally there would be no guns. And what I'm saying when I say that is ideally there would be no reason to have guns. But we don't live in a situation where authority and power and all of that stuff is like fully democratized. That's not what we live in. We live in a situation in which there's always an authority over us, whether it be multi-level or single level. And frankly, what you just said, would there have been a French Revolution? Would there be the United States? Would they have overthrown the czars?
Yeah.
Like none of that stuff would happen if there wasn't an armed populace. And that's the thing that I think a lot of people who are anti-gun tend not to think about. But the reason is they think that the status quo just needs to be adjusted in some way and everything will be fine. And I disagree with that personally. I think there's a lot that has to be done. I do agree that it doesn't just happen overnight, and we don't just have like a utopian vision that we project onto the world and say, look, we need to do that. Absolutely. Like, I think we need to have a generalized goal and get there through experimentation and criticism. But I don't think that an entirely unarmed populace, especially, there are a lot of people who will characterize the United States as a world empire. And if you do that, the idea that the populace who might not agree with the idea of participating in world empire, it seems absurd to me. You'd want to disarm.
Yeah. No, this makes sense. A listener question for you, Peter. This is from ABK. Thanks for the super chat.
$50. Thanks. Wow.
ABK.
Thanks, ABK.
So, what would Peter do? Here's what it says. What will Peter do if an armed individual breaks into his house and robs him? What should happen next? I think what she's making a reference to is did you see in Minneapolis when they were talking about, I think a CNN person was interviewing one of the council person, and when they abolished the police, and she asked the person, well, what am I supposed to do if
someone breaks in?
And then she goes, that's coming from a place of privilege.
Doesn't work.
Yeah.
And that's why there needs to be an actual alternative proposed, because we get into that type of a situation. Like I said, I'm not for disarmament. I'm not for taking guns from people, because I believe in the material conditions of today, which are not ideal. I don't think that we live in an ideal world. And I think that very few people would say the world as it is right now is absolutely entirely as it should be. It's perfect. What I would do if I had somebody who broke into my house with a gun and threatened me, not ideally, but I would hope that me having a gun might dissuade them from acting. I might have a gun myself that I hold up towards them and be like, maybe you should leave my house.
Sure.
I'm not the kind of person who's like, hey, I morally oppose this thing, and therefore whatever the world is like today, I don't care. It should be as I morally enforce. I'm not that kind of a person.
What would you call the police?
Would I call the police? It depends on what happened.
Sure.
Like, is somebody injured? Is somebody hurt?
Let's say you came home and all your stuff's gone.
Well, that's a good question. I don't know, to be honest with you. It's hard for me to actually say. I probably would call the police.
Yeah. And unfortunately, like I was saying before, I mean, this is the recourse that we have, and that's
not really. It's. I mean, would I want to call the police?
Of course, no one ever wants.
But
to call
realistically,
the police.
I have no one. Like, if I called, I don't have insurance on all of my stuff, so I couldn't call them.
Yeah. Right.
So, I mean,
well, you
from a
could, and
material
then
perspective, who you gonna call?
they would
you know?
they would require you
They
to
would
call
require
a
a
police.
police report.
Yeah, right. Yeah, which is the funny
Yeah, but
thing.
there was a weird case in the New York Times that was mentioning, a guy got a carjacked, gun put into his chest, and then he didn't want to press charges.
Yeah, he didn't want to call a police.
And I thought, isn't this like, I don't know, some kind of weird morality, or I don't know, just hysteria going too far? Like, somebody puts a gun, that's weird.
I would say that to some extent, there's a wish to live in the perfect world that you envision in your head that a lot of people attempt to do. And I think that it's good to have ideals, and it's good to have a sort of generalized goal of what you would like society to be in your advocacy and work towards that.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think that you are bound to the material conditions of today. You're not allowed not to be not to participate in capitalism. When you go buy food, when you buy like ramen noodles, you're participating in capitalism. It's not like you're evil for doing that. I don't necessarily like capitalism. I advocate against it, but like, we're all participating in it. We don't really have a choice. And from that perspective, that's basically what I think with all of these types of questions. Like, what really route to accountability or recourse do you have other than, like, let's say, and I'm not necessarily saying that the police handle this right every time, but let's say somebody gets sexually assaulted. Do you just, all right, whatever, I guess that's that. No, you don't. That's not something that anybody would I think, like, that's the only real recourse you have for sexual assault at this time. So I would think that, it would make sense to go to the hospital, call the authorities, et cetera, et cetera. It's to your own detriment as a victim in particularly extreme cases, like all of my stuff is gone, or an act of violence has been, like, it sucks. Yeah. But that's really the only avenue you have to, unless you're perfectly satisfied with nothing at all happening.
But you could opt out.
You're damned if you do, damned if you don't, more or less.
Are the Amish, for example, have they mostly opted out of capitalism?
I would say no, because they sell stuff.
Yeah, correct. Yeah,
well, it depends, right? Like, you have those that drive around and like lacquer,
They opt out of the capitalist way of life, but they're still participating. They're still getting their supplies from the overall capitalist structure.
That's right.
They have a supply chain. They have to buy food, ingredients, things like that. I'm sure they get a different kind, but it's not as if that stuff doesn't come from capitalism.
Right. Well, some does, but like what in northeastern Indiana, where I go to often, you see a very, very conservative sect of Amish that rarely do this. Most of these people don't even speak English. They still speak Pennsylvania Dutch. Yeah. So unless you can speak that, it's hard to communicate with them. They look to be living subsistence farming life, and that community comes together. So you can opt out to a large degree. Well, they've even gotten out of, they don't have to pay taxes.
Yeah. There's one question I think that we fail to ask a lot of times. I think a lot of people fail to ask this question. But Peter, if you had, based on your worldview, what does success look like? What is a current example of something that is closest to what you would think,
or compromise utopia. You'd be happy with?
But like, what are there any specific examples right now that success looks like for you?
Well, up until recently, I would have said Cooperation Jackson, but somebody made a documentary that showed that was basically propped up by nonprofits. So it's hard.
I don't know what that is.
That one for.
Yeah.
It was kind of it was it is an organization that's more or less attempting to find some way to opt out of capitalism to some extent. But
okay.
You can look at your Rojavas, you can look at your Mondragon, the Spanish co-op corporation, which is actually a pretty thriving example of some sort of work towards that. But again, it is a co-op, and it is a corporation that's still participating in capitalism, but it's definitely a big step forward, especially if we're talking compromise. But I would even go ahead and say that to some extent, the Amish example that you brought up, if it's subsistence farming, that's definitely further along than a lot of projects are.
Okay.
Right.
Good.
Now the problem with subsistence farming is, I think they'll do a lot of their own child care as far as midwives and this and that. But what if you're hit? I mean, these people get into car accidents too, and there's nothing worse than a buggy car accident, right? Obviously, you're going.
Or
to
let's
the
just say you're
hospital
walking
there,
down
too.
the side of the road and somebody hits you. That's not out of the realm of possibility.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's
So-
a good point.
Yeah, I know. Then we probably don't have too much time to get into healthcare. It was interesting what you were saying is I just don't know why it needs to be right. I get that all of this that I ideally want to make healthcare available to everyone. I get that.
Yeah.
Why it needs to be a right, I don't. And why can't there be at least some personal stake in it, meaning some kind of copay? Because
Give and
anything
take,
that's totally free,
Mhm.
we don't want to manage. And I feel like if there's at least a small, even if it was a small rider on there, you would attempt to manage it better, and we wouldn't abuse.
Well,
the
I mean,
system.
we have systems like the French system, which are actually like that. There's they're much, much smaller copays than what we're talking about. They're 95% public system. There's about 5% that are, private insurers, and you're paying like $30 to go to a doctor's appointment. You're paying $40-50 for a surgery even.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that that's bad. I would certainly, if that was the case, I would say let's move to that from where we are right now. But when you see something like the Canadian system or the at the NHS in the United Kingdom, where it is no paying at point of service, it's entirely taxpayer funded. You do actually have a stake in it. It's your taxes. And ultimately, the actual per capita amount that it costs ends up going down because the body that's doing the negotiating with the hospitals and all of the, and I'm talking Canadian rather than NHS at this point because the NHS is all simply owned by the government. But if we move to a Medicare for all type system, it would be much more like Canada's. And the body that is doing the negotiating is ultimately much more powerful. It's a single entity. It's backed by the entirety of the country. All of the taxpayer money is going into it. It's a large negotiating body. So you end up having the price per capita go way down. And again, you still have a stake in it. It's just that it's your taxes and it's not something that you actually think about from that perspective.
Okay. So
Well,
you're not a stalwart. That's what I wanted to know.
I just bring up one point on the healthcare topic. I know a lot of people always talk about the NHS and Canada and stuff, but right here in the U.S. we have an example that we can compare to. We have the VA hospitals, which are the hospitals that veterans can go to free of charge. The government runs it, and they're not very high rated. These.
Well, also, yeah. I mean, I think that isn't really the most helpful example on account there is a constant fight over funding the VA. There's a very large amount of bills that are passed it makes it a lot harder for them to do what they're actually trying to do. Like you end up seeing Jon Stewart does a lot of advocacy, and I'm not necessarily saying that Jon Stewart is the best guy out there or anything, but he does a ton of advocacy for keeping funding in the VA.
Sure.
Not just particularly for the 9/11 or 9/11, 9/11.
Yeah,
sorry.
9/11. Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
brain fart there.
Yeah.
But he's particularly advocating for the 911 or 9/11 first responders, but also ultimately his advocacy affects the VA. They're constantly having to fight for funding, and that's one of the bigger problems of the VA.
I totally agree with you, but when it comes to budgets and fiscal budgets and the government setting aside costs and stuff for this, that's what it's going to turn into for everyone's healthcare. Then it's going to be and it's
yes,
like,
but once you codify it as a universal system,
yeah.
Then everybody has an equal stake in it. It's much, much harder to get rid of it because then you're taking something from everyone. So to some extent, you are stuck with funding it in a manner that you wouldn't be stuck if it's a means tested or a specific group. Like you end up, I mean, I'm not saying that the U.S. democracy works properly, but you do end up, you do end up with a large amount of accountability with a universal system that you wouldn't otherwise have.
Okay. It'd be interesting. I don't know. I kind of like the mixed system we have, where people they're
if you can get the French version of what we have right now, I'm there for it. I'll take it. I'm more than happy to pay $30 to go to the doctor.
There you go.
In your world, last question. In your world, what's more important, like uplifting the poor or punishing the rich?
Uplifting the poor. I don't really give a shit about punishing the rich, to be honest with you.
Excellent.
I'm totally with you. Yeah, in fact, I think that those that are more interested in that actually then don't have an interest in uplifting the poor or the working class. And that's
well, here's the thing. If we were to set everything up systemically, that everything was fair, and when I say fair, obviously that's a bit of a loaded term because everybody has a different version of what fair means. But fair by whatever it sounds like I'm advocating for at the moment. But I don't think you'd have the same kind of gap. Mm-hmm. I don't think you'd see the big kind of difference that you see. And it's not necessarily that I want to take rich people's lives. I don't want to. I mean, obviously, at some point, revolutions are sometimes necessary. Like the czars were obviously really tyrannical, and I'm not saying that the USSR ended up turning out way better or anything,
right, yeah.
But
Stalin
there's
was
a
no
reason
godson.
why. Yeah, there's a reason why they went up against the czars. There's a reason why the French Revolution happened, the American Revolution. There's these things are sometimes necessary, but ultimately, what most people, I would think, of the persuasion that I'm coming from would want is just to be able to, resolve the issues of society in a manner that ends up with a fair society.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, Peter, I just want to. No, go ahead. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
No, I was just going to say, it's just that a lot of the time people get in the way of that. That's the problem.
Yeah, I'll let Brian close it off because I got to go shut it down. But thanks. I just want to say thank you for coming on, man. It sucks.
Of course. Thank you for having me. This is a great conversation.
Absolutely. It sucks that you can't be there in August. We would have loved to have you on stage with Milo. I think it would have been a really, really good conversation. The mob is what the mob is.
What the mob is.
And that's got to start changing, in my opinion. I think they sink to new lows every day. But I'll let Brian finish it off.
And what sucks is and our positions are a bit different, right? I'm a slightly right-leaning libertarian. You're a leftist. That there's a pretty good distance between those two. But I think what you're trying to get at is the leftist critique. And that's what we wanted to do. I think the leftist critique's actually important because there's a few things where we agree. And I think you're trying to expose those. You're not saying, I know how to fix them. You're saying, hey, here's an issue. Can we address this, please?
Absolutely.
And that's
yes. I think that we find that. Sorry, a lot of the time we have a criticism that's going to be very similar with, let's say, a right populist. It's just ultimately our prescription is it tends to be universal, or it tends to be oriented towards specifically a class, or if the problem is much more specific, perhaps whatever group it's specific to.
Yep. It's great. Yeah. And so anyone out there that's like me, that is anywhere in my jurisdiction of politics, definitely check Peter's videos out, because you can't argue your own position if you don't know other people's positions. Anywhere you're on, I think that you do a really good job of giving a leftist perspective, and your videos are really good.
I appreciate that very much.
Okay, and then stay on afterwards. We want to have a word, and but appreciate it. Everyone, check him out.
Of course, thank you so much.
Peter Coffin. You can check him out on Twitter, and that is let me see, Peter Coffin on
at
Twitter.
Peter Coffin.
Yep. And I believe that the YouTube is the same, Peter Coffin.
Same.
Check it out. Liberalism sucks. Really does, I think, put it in a good nutshell, and it's pretty funny. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks. Thank you.